Well, hello, y'all, and welcome back. It is another race weekend, and therefore we've got more to talk about in the F1 world. Obviously, as always, we will be starting with the results of the Mexican Grand Prix, and you can see the fun that is headed down to turn one, even against a bunch of robots. So let's keep it casual on the way in there. Unlike real life, most everybody tries to stay on the road in turn 1, 2, and 3 this time. But that part aside, we'll get into it the way we normally do, talking our way down the grid, starting with the top slot, which was an incredible performance from Lando Norris this race weekend. The kind of, championship-defining type performances that I thought neither driver had really had, where they really took the bull by the horns and went out and got a result. Lando Norris did that this weekend, this race, with a very strong pole position result and an absolutely dominant race result out in the clear air to get the championship lead away from his teammate Oscar Piastri for the first time in quite a margin. Now, it is only down to a single point variation between the two, but Oscar has indeed lost the championship lead. And Oscar did rebound from a relatively poor qualifying result, starting P8. He was able to get himself back up into the top 5, which is a solid result considering how difficult it proved to be to overtake around the circuit. And arguably he could have gotten, retained his championship lead if it were not for that late VSC due to the retirement of Carlos Sainz. I think he was shaping up for a pretty good run at Ollie Behrman, who was running out of tires at that point. But, Oscar's difficulties in making his way through the field was I think, one of the better examples of the year of just how much the dirty air effect makes as far as following another car, how much it impacts your pace, and then also how difficult it is to overtake at this stage of the regulations. Just because of how quickly, Lando was able to go in the clear air. Granted, Oscar was a little bit behind Lando's just outright pace, even in clean air. But it was a pretty big example of how clean air is king. But realistically, there wasn't a whole lot to talk about from the McLarens, which I guess is a good thing since they've been such a hotbed for team orders controversy. I guess when you're not near your teammate, it's hard to have team orders controversy. So Oscar is in dire need of a bounce-back performance for sure. Let me get through this little technical section before I scroll down, although I do know that the next team we are going to be talking about is none other than the Ferrari F1 team. And Lewis had one of his best qualifying performances, really, of the season. Finally looked to be pretty comfortable with the car. Unfortunately, that optimism he had leading into the race was ended pretty quickly by the chaos of lap 1, which ultimately resulted in a 10-second time penalty for Lewis. I think both Ferraris had probably the outright pace to have a double podium. It could have gone Lando and then Leclerc or Lewis, one of the two of them. But that 10-second penalty ended it. It's a tough situation for sure. So we go a little bit deep. But for Lewis, I think, in my opinion, it's a really weird way that they had the exit road rejoining the track. I was kind of surprised to hear that the race director's notes were to take that little escape road, because you can kind of see it. It's a real sharp angle to the track. And F1 cars do not exactly have a great turning radius. So realistically, I think if you take that escape road, you have to almost go across the entire track into the line of fire to rejoin. That being said, it was not the rejoin that earned him the penalty. It is what they classed as leaving the track and gaining an advantage. I can kind of see it, but my disagreement stems from the fact that he was on the outside of Max. Max himself did not make the corner. So even if Lewis was able to make the corner, if there was an opportunity for him to make the corner, he would have been forced off the road and had to take to the runoff anyway. And also, I think in isolation, he still probably should have lifted and given up some time. However, the reason I'm qualifying it by saying it in isolation is the whole reason that he was even under attack by Max into turn 4 was because the momentum that Max had by essentially cutting turn 2 and straight lining and being able to go straight from turn 3 gave him a good run and momentum to then attack. And also, you're not supposed to, take advantage of an off track. And I believe watching it back that Max gained some momentum while everybody else was having to sort it out side by side through turns 2 and 3 and getting slow exits. He essentially was able to get a straight line. So that's part of it. I don't know that Max should have even attacked Lewis into that corner, into turn 4. I think he should have stayed kind of where he was since he went off track. But also, Leclerc also was another one who cut turns 1 and 2 and just was miles ahead of everybody else and probably should not have retained that second position. I'm sure the stewards are going to go, oh, well, it was a Ferrari staying ahead of a Ferrari, so no foul or whatever, which I disagree with. You should ignore what team the cars are on because it does affect the rest of the positions as well. For example, George Russell's complaints as he stayed on the road and other cars didn't, and he was disadvantaged because of it. So I think that it's a little tough for Lewis. Essentially, a lot of cars got that lap 1 grace when it comes to going side by side, being forced off track, not giving up the positions correctly. And Lewis was the only one who got pinged with a 10-second penalty for it. So disappointing on a day where Lewis was really optimistic that he could probably challenge for his first Ferrari podium. But alas, 10-second penalty kept him out of the mix for the rest of the day. That 2-stop strategy also changed it up for him. Leclerc, regardless of lap 1 and the grace, he drove really, really well for the rest of the race. Really extended that first soft tire stint a good long way to make it even a race between him and Max at the end there. I do think that the late VSC definitely helped out Leclerc. I think Max was pretty close to getting by Charles at the end there if it wasn't for that last VSC. So, and I'll talk about it more as I get to other drivers, but it does seem that VSC prevented a couple changes of position, I would say. Okay, let me get out of the S's and we'll look next, but I believe next on the list is Red Bull, of course. Max Verstappen had a rough start to trying to continue his championship challenge, qualifying P5. And in spite of all of his comments going into the race of just going to be patient, going to drive his own race, sure seems by the time he arrived at turn 1, all of that was out the window as he decided to brake on the curb, which has very low grip, and as a result had to, make that lovely turn 1, 2, 3 cut to stay in it. But otherwise, I think a fantastic drive for him when everybody else was, making the choice for the 2-stop to just lock in and go for the 1-stop. It looked like very much through that race, the long run that he did on those mediums was not going to be the right choice. He was, he had to make up a lot of ground to get back into that race. So commendable drive from him there. Interesting little peek behind the curtain on the radio when, Max is asking if they were extending or boxing, and you heard GP talking to the actual strategists. Are we on a 1-stop or a 2-stop? Because, it's important to kind of recognize that the engineers are really just, they're the mouthpiece. There are whole other teams that are doing strategy and all that other stuff. It's the engineer's job to really relay all that stuff in a clear, concise manner to their driver. Although, I'll be honest, when it first happened, I thought he was doing a fairly typical cheeky response, because Max and GP have often had that kind of chit-chat with each other. I thought it was well, we haven't called you in yet, Max. Obviously, we're on a 1-stop. If we were on a 2-stop, we would have called you in by now. Kind of cheeky comment, but that was not the case. It was indeed a look behind the curtain. On the other side of the garage, on the other side of the garage, Yuki Tsunoda had an okay weekend, considering, his bar is pretty low, unfortunately, for what we're expecting out of him. Gosh, the car feels real floaty. Are we killing the tires already? But it was pretty obvious early on that they ran Yuki very long to serve as a blocker for Max, because he essentially stayed out on that opening stint so long and then came in after Piastri caught him and passed him. So it kind of seems like they were leaving Tsunoda out there just to hamper Piastri's progress, which all's fair in the game, for sure. But he would have been in position, I think, for some points, for a points-paying finish, if not for, and this didn't seem to get caught on the broadcast, Yuki had a 12-second stop. His pit stop was hideously slow and kind of hung him out to dry. So for him to still finish 12th, even with a stop of that magnitude, I think he was driving a pretty decent race. And circling back to Verstappen, since I want to note it, in addition to the lap 1 incident where he didn't stay on through turn 4 and Hamilton went off and that was Hamilton's penalty, there was also the second instance when he passed Hamilton down into turn 1. And it's once again one of the situations that's brought about by the ahead at the apex rule, which I despise. Because Max took a pretty decent lunge, but he definitely rolled off the brakes at the end to make sure his nose was ahead when they got to the apex. And then he made contact with Hamilton, who was giving him plenty of space on the outside. Again, this is why I hate this rule, is because even though there was plenty of track width for Verstappen to use and not run into Hamilton, by the rule, because his nose was ahead, Hamilton has to instantaneously disappear from that outside spot, meaning that the investigation for contact was going to be either no action or a penalty for Hamilton for just not vanishing, even though he had 99% of his car alongside. So, short version, once again, the stupid rule comes into play, the rule that I hate, because it kills racing. Because imagine if Max was required to leave that space because Lewis was still alongside. Then Lewis would have to leave space on the way to turn 2, and they would have to leave space for each other on the way to turn 3. And you would get a really good back and forth, like 3-corner battle. Instead, Verstappen is able to just put his elbow out, and not just Max, anybody is able to just put an elbow out and push the other car off the track, or run into them, and job done. So, that is my frustration with that rule as always. Next up, we'll move on. We've got Haas in their highest mentioned spot this season. And the team looked pretty strong this weekend overall. Esteban got closer to Behrman in qualifying than he had been recently, so maybe he's finding a little something as P10, P12 for the most of him. So Ali made it to Q3, but Ocon still the upper reaches of Q2. And in the race, Ali really navigated the mess of turn 1 very well and found himself running in the podium position, P3. And I was very surprised that the pace looked really good from Behrman because, Lewis and Max had issues kind of chasing him down. And even later in the race, it took quite a bit of effort for Oscar to start to wheel in Ollie Behrman. So his career best finish, fantastic, as well as just kind of an exclamation points for a double points finish for the Haas team, as Esteban was able to secure a P9 finish as well. And I said I would mention it before, the VSC definitely came to the benefit of Ollie, as I was looking at my notes and not in the right spot of the track to brake, but we're driving on lower AI. But that late VSC, Piastri was getting ready to shape up a move on Behrman, and if that move had come to fruition, it would have still been Oscar Piastri leading the Drivers' Championship by 1 point his direction. So, or actually it would have been 2, because it would be just 2 point swing. 2 point swing because they were out of the podium places. Yep. But yeah, so that also, very good day for Ollie. I'm very impressed by the way he drove, and I'm impressed by the Haas because just the pace looked good, and they continue to just kind of be a mystery for how fast is the Haas team that's going to show up this weekend. Because sometimes they look like the worst car on the grid. Other times, they're running lap times with the Ferraris almost, which is a pretty impressive surprise. And, Behrman continues to stamp his mark on the team as well, ahead of Esteban Ocon, really raising his profile, not just for in the short term to be, potentially de facto team leader over his more experienced teammate, but as a Ferrari junior driver, especially as rumors start to swirl with Ferrari unsure of extending Hamilton past his 2026 contract, it might be that Ollie Behrman is next in line for the Ferrari car, whichever spot opens up. Of course, Leclerc could go somewhere. I doubt it, but you never rule anything out when it comes to F1 driver markets. Next up, Mercedes. They were kind of in an anonymous position. They had okay pace on the weekend. George put in his pretty typical, very strong Saturday performance. Unfortunately, he was kind of disadvantaged by being one of the cars to actually try and take turns 1, 2, and 3 on lap 1, and went from P4 and dropped his way down in that kind of mess. So definitely cost him some positions and left him stuck in a battle with his teammate, with Oliver Behrman, for a considerable chunk of the race, which is not what he would want, I'm sure, but that kind of seems to be the pace of the Mercedes this weekend. Antonelli drove pretty well as well to get ahead of George, and they secured a solid inline finish, P6, P7. Granted, that was not without any drama, because George was certainly the highlight of the radio sessions in the middle of the race. Stuck behind Kimi Antonelli with Oscar Piastri breathing down his neck in a DRS train. And there was some very fun and colorful language that George Russell used, which was kind of amusing. But I think in general, he was right to be so insistent. And realistically, I think the hesitancy of the team cost them part of their result, because by the time they finally did do that swap around for George to try and chase down Ollie Behrman, his tires had already been pretty well damaged by sitting in the dirty air, having to go offline to make defensive moves against Piastri. So I think that really cost them the opportunity for, at that point, what could have been a podium position, because we weren't sure how Max's race was going to unfold. Ultimately, though, he did give that position back as Piastri made his way past the both of them once they kind of started stringing out. So not a big surprise there. And he honored his word. He gave the position back to Antonelli if he wasn't able to get to Behrman. I don't know. I think it's, if you're a team, you got to make those swap choices early. Like, you got to commit and just get it done, because waiting 4 or 5 laps and then doing it, you've just kind of shot yourself in the foot entirely with the combination. Who is next? Next up is the Sauber team. Gabriel Bortoleto managed to scratch together a P10 finish and a point, but Nico Hülkenberg did have another weekend where he was able to get ahead of his teammate on the Saturday, which has been badly needed for him. He's been in a bit of a struggle bus kind of formation for a little while. But to get back ahead of Gabby, at least on the Saturday, was good. It was unfortunately not really much to see for Nico on Sunday, as he was victim of a mechanical issue and had to retire the car. So hard to say if he would have performed and been in a similar spot and had the similar gains that Bortoleto did, who climbed up 6 positions in order to grab the last points paying position for the Sauber team. So the Sauber is starting to look like it's a decent performing car that can operate right at the fringes of the points, kind of week in and week out at this stage. And that's got to be encouraging for Audi looking on in the background, getting ready to take over that team. Not necessarily because the current car is good, but it does seem that the technical team is starting to put together at least correlation and things that make a difference when it comes to the next year's car. Next up, we've got Williams. Carlos was very quick. Realistically, both cars looked pretty quick. Carlos especially, though, he qualified, went P7 in qualifying, however, had that looming 5-place grid penalty from his incident at COTA. And even though he was still pretty hopeful when it came to pace that he could make it up for it, but it did not go that way for the team, as for Carlos, the lap 1 contact he had with Liam Lawson caused damage to one of his wheel speed sensors, which as a result caused problems with his pit limiters. So that's the reason why he had those speeding in the pit lane penalties. Essentially, the the wheel speed was giving weird readings, and so the pit limiter was constantly saying, oh, it's going too slow, oh, it's going too fast, and therefore jostling the speed. If you watched any of the onboards, you'd see it was very herky-jerky down the pit lane, and therefore is what, when it was not reading properly, it was going, oh, I need to speed up, and was causing him to outspeed the pit lane. And he got 2 penalties for that, which really kind of put his race in the dumps. When he was on track, he was plenty quick. Alex Albon, on the other hand, had a very poor showing on Saturday. Had to start from P17 on the grid, so a long way back. At that point, the Williams team decided to put him on the hard tire and just go for that total gamble long strategy. He did make up a fair bit of ground overall pace-wise, but it still wasn't enough to get them towards the points. Of course, Carlos Sainz, even with the pit lane problems, his woes for the day would not be over, as he was indeed the cause for that late race safety car, as his engine decided no more. And failed on him. There was a bit of a fire there, which wasn't really shown on the broadcast. Since it was in the stadium section, I know people are wondering, oh, why did they not just double yellow? The back half of his car was still kind of in the firing line on the exit of the really awkward chicane we just kind of went through. And the back of the car was on fire. There was fire in the engine bay, so there had to be marshals first to put the fire out before they could even think about moving the car behind the wall. So in retrospect, it was the right call for that VSC to be out there, because from some of the camera angles, it looked like the car was fully in the gap, but the back end of the car was still in the firing line. Marshals were therefore on track, putting out that fire, and had to keep that VSC open. What else we got? Yeah, that's about it for Williams. We'll talk more when we get to the Brazil portion and talk about what we're expecting for Brazil and the rest of the season going forward. Okay, next up is the RB team. Isaac Hadjar started off the weekend well enough with a Q3 appearance. And getting himself back ahead of Liam. Lawson, on the other hand, P15 was not bad. P9 and P15 were the qualifying positions for the 2 V-Carb guys. However, that being further back in the pack definitely got Liam into trouble. He was involved with some contact on lap 1, had to come in for a front wing change, and ultimately retired a couple of laps later. So it was kind of a non-starter type of day for Lawson. Hadjar, on the other hand, kind of fell victim to one of the classic V-Carb kind of days, where the pace looked decent, but the team did not adapt well enough to the changing situation. It was kind of a mix between 1 and 2 stop throughout the grid. I think more cars went 1 stop, but 2 stop was definitely still viable pace-wise. It was very clear early on that Hadjar had a lot more degradation than they were expecting, but they kept him on the 1-stop strategy, and he just kind of fell through the pack on old dead tires. His pace was several seconds slower than some of the cars around him at stages in that race. So I think if V-Carb identifies that earlier, makes the call to put him on a 2-stop, I think he's got a chance at retaining his points paying position. Granted, I will say, with Liam being out so early, they were lacking extra data points that teams always like to see, and more specifically, data points for how their own car is behaving. So they maybe, if Liam was still in the race, could have also seen that, it would have been the right call to go to this 2-stop. But realistically, I think at this stage of the season, it's not so much about the true results, if they're scoring points or not. It's really coming down to an audition between Isaac and Liam for that second Red Bull seat potentially next year. Because I think unless Yuki does something heroic that secures Max the driver's title, I doubt we'll see Yuki with the team next year. Next up is Aston Martin, which, you know, they had a modest showing of pace. There was something there at Texas. This weekend, there was just not a lot to see. They were just kind of in the middle of nowhere, pace-wise. A P19 qualifying position for Lance, P14, so at least Fernando got it into Q2. Lance did recover a handful of positions in the race by being one of the drivers to make the earliest swap and commit to the two-stop strategy, so it did gain a lot of positions for him, did make a pretty big difference. But Fernando was once again struck with bad luck and another retirement for a team that is, you know, essentially going to be a works team with Honda taking over the power units next year. It's not the kind of trend that is encouraging, with Aston kind of, for the most part, limping their way to the finish line. And the last team to talk about, and it feels like it's becoming commonplace, Alpine. Just a weekend to unfortunately forget, and not all that uncommon for them. Two of the bottom three cars in qualifying, as well as the last two cars running again. Not a very good look for the team, but
coming in for his stop now.
At least this week they did it without making a laughing stock of themselves by getting caught on the radio calling for team orders for the last two slots. So Alpine, I think, is just waiting for this season to end as much as they can. But certainly a disappointing weekend for the team. But that rounds out the results, the teams, what I saw as far as Mexico goes. Now let's head over to the next circuit, and we'll talk about the track, potential strategies, and we'll talk through the teams themselves to what to look out for. So welcome to Sao Paulo, Brazil. We're here at Interlagos. Fantastic, classic circuit. And unlike my usual park in the pole position slot, I'm parked a little further back to show something interesting. You can see the uniqueness of this starting grid. Way back at the back of the grid, we're actually on a bit of a downhill slope into this little bowl, while the front part of the grid is on an uphill slope. So it makes for some very interesting getaways, especially as the first few cars are launching off the line in an uphill manner. So let me roll forward a bit to the actual pole position spot, and we will continue to talk about this track in the way we normally do. So here we go. You can see me rolling up the hill now and parking in P1. And take a look at the track map on the right. It's not a very long run down to turn one and the complex of corners. But the act of drivers having to adapt to the different slope of the track, which is very different from anywhere else. Most starting grids are totally flat and straight. You've got a little bit of variance to deal with here. It can make for some interesting runs into turn one. And it's also one of those turn complexes that is very wide on entry and then narrows down. But it being at the end of a pretty significant DRS zone, it is one of the better overtaking opportunities on the track. And Sao Paulo is a track you can overtake on. So we will head up the hill, over the crest, and down to turn 1. So the Senna S, named after Ayrton Senna, the opening 3-corner complex, this very tricky downhill left-hander, tight right-hander, and then this flat-out left-hand sweeper. Makes that opening complex. You open up the DRS again, and you're down to turn 4, which is Descida del Lago. View of the lake. View of the lake? It's something of the lake. But it's also a good overtaking opportunity. An interesting kind of over the crest, a little downhill slope that you are having to brake and turn into. Big runoff. Obviously, we've seen Max Verstappen on multiple occasions go ahead and go up the inside and then drive all the way over here before he comes back on the track. Look out for that, especially because Max is in for a championship fight. After those first couple of corners, you're in a section that is, aside from the first lap or two, going to be very difficult to overtake through. Usually, it's pretty much single file through what is considered like the infield section of the track. It's an interesting little technical combination of corners that you definitely want to get yourself up for. You do see some guys take lunges up the inside of this corner here. But then, as you head over, you're now getting ready to wind up the speed before the final straight. Really important corner here. Little awkward one called Junção, the junction in Portuguese. Tricky little left-hander. We've seen lots of drivers take different lines through there. Some will climb over that apex curb to get the car to rotate more. Others will stay away from it to keep the track car level. But then you are flat out all the way until you open up the DRS, and then you have a pretty good run to set up on the way down into turn 1, which makes for a very good side-by-side battling section of the track. So we'll pick up the pace a little bit now. More close to seeing, how much you actually have to slope for the different corners, how much power you can put down, and where we go. Of course, DRS only in these 2 sections, but it could mean nothing because Brazil famously is one of the more weather-happy tracks of the year. And it does appear that the rain could play a factor in this weekend as well. It is a sprint weekend. And currently the weather forecast is expecting rain potentially on Saturday. So it would be the sprint race and potentially Grand Prix qualifying. There is a small chance of rain on the day of the Grand Prix, but likely it will be cleared out before the race actually begins. It should be overcast and kind of cloudy during the race, but you never know. Things can go crazy around Brazil. And the other thing that the rain may play a factor in, of course. Oh, there's a big lock up into turn 1. You can see how, if you're not careful, you'll unload that front tire and go straight on for a while and lose tons of time. But the other thing that the rain can play a factor in is tire strategy. So last year they brought the C3, C4, and C5 tires to the circuit. They didn't see any much use because of the rain. The Grand Prix was wets and inters the entire way, so we really didn't get a good idea of what those tires would be like last year. However, doesn't matter too much because this year we are not bringing those 3 tires. It is not the C3, 4, 5 combo. It is the C2, 3, and 4 combo, which is 1 step harder than last year's set. It is, however, the same compound of tires that was brought at the 2023 race. Now in 2023, we did see the 2-stop being the most prevalent strategy, with it being mostly medium and soft tires being utilized. The hard tire didn't seem to be a very good race tire 2 years ago. That being said, the way the trend has gone, typically races that were 2-stop on the 2023 cars and tires have been have shifted to a 1-stop more recently. So I would suspect that we are probably in for a 1-stop strategy at the Grand Prix. That being said, because it is possible to overtake on Interlagos, it's not so punishing as many of the other tracks for the overtaker. It is possible that a 2-stop could come out as an alternate to try and make some overtakes. So that kind of is the strategy, the weather that's coming up. Now let's talk about what we should expect to see, what we're looking for this race weekend. We'll go championship order by constructors. So McLaren, starting at the top. According to some comments from Zach Brown this week, they are not planning on making any selections on which driver is going to get preference, regardless of how close Max gets at the end of the season. He said he would rather have a 2007 situation, which was famously Lewis Hamilton and Fernando Alonso. Lewis Hamilton nearly becoming a rookie champion, losing out to Kimi Räikkönen, which was, I believe, Ferrari's last Drivers' Championship by just a single point. And they did not favor either car towards the end of the season. Fernando did some things. We'll leave it at that. And Lewis Hamilton earned his first championship the next year in 2008. But we will see if that's truly the case, which I have my doubts about because they've constantly said stuff. It's going to be a very important weekend for both drivers. First off, it's going to be very important for Lando in the grand scheme context because he had, while in the midst of a potential championship challenge against Verstappen, it was one of those critical races. He kind of had a stinker of a Brazilian Grand Prix last year and did not perform very well. So, you know, from his perspective, getting back to the feeling, continuing what he did in Mexico last time out, but also, you know, showing up and driving well in Brazil, especially if it rains, will be a big boon to his championship hopes. And of course, for Oscar on the other side of the garage, he's been in a slump for sure the last handful of races. Granted, Texas and Mexico were kind of bogey races for him as well. Last year, I think it's going to be real important for Oscar to qualify and have a good result around here for certain. Next up, we will talk about is Ferrari. Ferrari has gotten back ahead of Mercedes in the Constructors' Championship by just a single point. So they're right there. It's a tight battle between the two of them. And, you know, the Hamilton penalty definitely played a big factor. It could have been a much bigger margin if Ferrari converts a double podium in Mexico, or even, you know, a P2, P4 kind of situation with Hamilton there. So it does appear that Ferrari is kind of figuring out the car. There's been a couple of tracks where I really expected them to struggle with their ride height issue and plank wear, Coda being a big one. And they've kind of started to show that they'll have pace and can maintain it throughout the race now. So I think that's a good sign for them to the end of the season. And it should make for an interesting end to the Constructors' Championship. That being said, as one of the biggest funded teams and has plenty in the bank, I don't think they're worried too much about the monetary value of finishing higher up in the Constructors' Championship, more than just the, you know, to be second and be the next best to McLaren over the year. Mercedes, Antonelli has continued to step up his game lately and is looking pretty good. George is continuing to do George Russell things, looking very, very strong. They're a tight fight with Ferrari in the constructors, of course, but I wouldn't expect them to be sacrificing any of their 2026 development to try and bridge the gap or bring a late upgrade that would be specifically for the purposes of challenging the Ferraris in the constructors. They may bring some upgrades that will help them with correlation on the 2026 car. Obviously, the cars themselves are going to be very different, but making sure that your CFD and wind tunnel results match real-life results is always a very, very important part. For Red Bull, if Yuki can string together some strong results, Red Bull may even find themselves in the mix with Ferrari and Mercedes before the season's done. And obviously, if Yuki starts getting involved in the top 5, that's pretty crowded, it could be also the kind of thing that opens up the door for the Drivers' Championship for Max. So it does look like Red Bull has sorted out some of their more serious procedural and correlation issues. I know there's been some interviews with Loren Mekies about where they're taking their, or how they're weighting their different sources of feedback on the upgrades, and it's paying dividends. So that's the kind of thing that are procedural that will continue into 2026 and are benefits all around. Maybe they continue to throw upgrades at the car if it still looks like Max has a chance for the Drivers' Championship. I know they'd love to be the spoilers to the party. That being said, Max is expected to take a 5-place grid penalty here in Brazil for he's taking another power unit component. I believe it's the combustion engine that he is taking another one of. Wow, that's really easy to lock up into there. So I would say it's definitely going to be some uphill sledding for Max as far as that Drivers' Championship, but it wouldn't be the first time that we've seen somebody bring a new engine to Brazil and eat the penalty, so to speak, by having an engine that they can keep turned up for the rest of the year. Because it is a track you can overtake on. Most notably, 2021 Mercedes putting that engine in Hamilton and him coming from way back and doing a lot of work in the sprint to work his way to Grand Prix victory. Who is next? Williams. Williams, I'm a bit concerned about because they keep running into reliability and even some just like procedure issues as far as getting their cars out on the right spots of the track and qualifying at the right times. It's a bit of a concern. The team, that has been best of the rest all season, they're obviously not having a problem with making a car that performs well mechanically and aerodynamically as far as grip-wise and drivability. But the frequent reliability problems are concerning because unlike, making a good front wing or making a floor that works with this regulation, things like reliability and qualifying strategy are the kind of things that will persist from regulation change to regulation change. And if they build a really good car for 2026 and start shooting themselves in the foot with these kind of issues, it's going to feel even worse than it is now when they are largely not under threat from anybody. VCARB, RB, Racing Bulls, whatever you want to call them now, still very much in the mix with Aston Martin for P6 in the Constructors' Championship. They should, based on the trends of the year, have an overall pace advantage compared to what I've been seeing out of the Aston Martin team. But they continue to make some inexplicable and kind of stubborn strategy choices, I would say, where it feels like at times they make the decisions before the race starts of, we're going to pit on this lap, we're going to do this strategy. And they often don't seem to adapt to the changing conditions of track position or degradation that is faster or slower than was expected from practice. So it is going to get interesting because I do think that Aston Martin does that part of the job better. I believe Aston Martin is probably one of the better teams on the grid at changing their strategy and adjusting on the fly. Of course, the help that Fernando Alonso provides in both his real complaints and his exaggerated complaints, it's feedback that they do take action on pretty consistently. And as we saw, for example, Lance Stroll was one of the first to go to the two-stop last race, and it paid dividends in terms of track position because he essentially undercut a bunch of his rivals, even though he had a pretty poor starting position. But yeah, VCARB, unlike many of the really big teams, I do think that the prize money payout difference between P6 and P7 could have an impact and is something that is worth chasing for their team. Next up, Aston, who we've already been talking about for a little bit. If I'm being honest, the Aston Martin team is really kind of disappointed over the course of this season. For especially, the big signing of Adrian Newey, the word that they'll be taking on Honda power units next year. I thought they would be doing, a bit more in trying to make that push for teams with big hopes next year, because oftentimes if you are becoming a works team, it's because you have thoughts of championships. I do think, though, that Aston Martin never really figured out how to develop this regulation set, because they came out of the gate very strong in the 2022 regs, but they've been falling back every single season, and they've never really kind of developed at the rate of any other team. So it seems that they just didn't understand the regs, which, well, we're going to a new regulation set. We'll see if they understand those. So I guess it's not that they didn't understand the regs. They got it right on the first time, but they didn't know how to. It appears they didn't know how to grow with the reg change and find the marginal gains rather than just coming up with a strong initial design. Unlike, for example, Red Bull, who did come out with a really good car and then continued to develop it and stayed ahead until the last year and a half of the regulation set, when they lost their way a bit, but it does seem they're finding their way back a bit more. I think that has more to do with their internal politics, but I'm getting off on a tangent. But back to Aston Martin. I think as a team, considering their ownership, they probably don't care as much about the financial benefit of being higher up in the constructors compared, and they're probably not going to worry about trying to throw upgrades to catch the few points to overtake VCARB. But you never know. Lawrence Stroll has been divesting from the car company of Aston Martin, which is independent of the F1 team, but is that maybe a general trend that he's thinking more about the money overall, in which case a constructor's payout would help, because that's less money out of his pocket to keep the team running, and prize money will take a bigger chunk of the cost cap. Next up is Haas. Obviously, big result in Mexico for them, catapulted them from P9 and a pretty decent margin behind Sauber up to P8 and only 7 points behind Aston Martin. So Haas definitely run by a team owner that would love the extra money from a good constructor's finish. So I expect them to try and chase the points to try and get that extra money. And I think another thing is under team boss Io Komatsu, who took over after Günther Steiner, we've seen a different trend for the Haas team where they, under Steiner, Haas seemed to always come out of the gate quite strong each year, but then never really had a lot of developments throughout the year. I don't know that they typically brought very many upgrades. Under Komatsu though, it does seem that that strategy has changed completely because Haas, while they are still a bit of a wild card week in and week out, the car does appear to have had development cycles go much later in the season, which I think is very good for them in that regard. So we'll see if they can continue that to the end of the season and then into next season as well. Next up, we've got Sauber. Sauber has a good pair of drivers looking to next year. Gabriel Bortoleto is really rounding into being a very quality rookie, especially compared against a pretty well-known quantity in Nico Hülkenberg. They aren't out of the running by any means to reclaim their position from Haas. So I would expect them to try and put up that fight. And I think they've been a little bit more of a consistent car than the Haas is, so I think there's a decent chance of it. But I would guess that their priorities probably lie a little bit more in helping Nico Hülkenberg continue to refine his qualifying form. I mean, last year at Haas, Nico Hülkenberg was a qualifying monster. And this year's really not been great for him, even compared to a rookie teammate. So I think that's going to be high on their priority list. And of course, preparing for a good 2026 season after the all told, even though they're P9 in the constructors, it's not a standard P9. All the midfield teams have looked pretty good this year for the most part. So I would say even though they're 9th in the constructors, 25 has still been a decent showing for that team. And lastly, you know them, you love them, it's Alpine, the team that is not good enough to be as political as they are. Dead last. I feel like they are just trying to get to the end of the year spending as little money as possible. They have no upgrades on the way. And it kind of almost seems like the drivers have almost been told, drive at like 70%. No risk of a crash. We don't want to pay a bunch of money in repairs. That's just kind of the way it seems the team is going. They're 40 points back of Sauber in P9 and only a few rounds left to go, and they've only gotten 20 all year. So unless they pop up and have a sudden couple of podiums, they're kind of locked into that P10 position for sure. And looking on to next year, though, they are looking forward to the Mercedes power unit. So maybe that gives them a little something. About the only news I expect before the end of the year from Alpine will be their 2026 driver choices. The rumors seem to be swinging a little more towards retaining Franco Colapinto for that second seat. Gasly's already been signed through 2028, I believe it is. But it looks like the Colapinto monetary backing is going to help him retain that seat on the border there. But that's all I've got. Sao Paulo sprint weekend should be an interesting one if the weather comes to fruition. As always, thank y'all for listening to me ramble. If you have any questions, comments, throw it down in the comments below and let me know. But I hope you all have a good one. Enjoy the race weekend. See y'all next time. Peace.